Hello and welcome to the Ancients, and today I'm doing a special little intro from the incredible Grand Temple at Abu Simbel. Those colossal statues you have there, each of them is of the one and only the pharaoh Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, and it's the story of his rise to prominence alongside that of his father and grandfather that we're covering in today's episode. Our guest today is the brilliant Dr Campbell Price from Manchester Museum. I really do hope you enjoy the episode. Let's get into it, just as I am getting into Abu Simbel.
Campbell, it is such a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Hello, Tristan. It's nice to be back.
And we've done episodes in the past up at your work home, Manchester Museum, and now you're down in our lovely studio in London.
Indeed.
And to talk about the rise of Ramesses II, first of all, and his dynasty, the 19th dynasty.
Yes, I mean, Ramesses II is a well-known household name, but It's interesting to consider how he became the Great and why people later thought he was so great.
I mean, a 66-year reign, isn't that correct?
Yeah.
Around that time, around that period. And normally, if someone says Ramesses II or Ramesses the Great, you might think this is the pinnacle of ancient Egypt. This is when it's at the top of its military might, its wealth, its art and architecture. Is that a fair assessment?
Some would tell you, some rather uncharitable people might say it had well past the zenith of ancient Egypt in terms of artistic production. And there is a sense, I'm sure it'll come up as we're talking, that Ramesses II is trying to recapture a few centuries before, when Egypt was really expanding, not so much an empire, I hesitate to use the word empire, but its kind of field of influence. So he's trying to influence people and places, neighbouring countries, neighbouring cultures in ways his predecessors would have done.
So actually he's kind of looking back to a golden age of years past in a revival time almost.
Yeah, he's got a bar, I think, in his head where he's trying to reach back to it. So yeah, we're talking about the 1200s BCE, but 1300s, 1400s, you're really getting the, for want of a better term, the imperial conquest.
And paint us a bit more of a picture briefly before we delve into the details. A quick picture of Ramesses the man, what we should get an idea of, how we should picture him before we delve into the origins of his rule and of his family.
Well, as you already said, he is exceptional because he rules for 66 years. With one exception, he's probably the longest reigning Egyptian pharaoh. So given it was a dangerous job being the king of any ancient power, you must have some personal charisma and command to not be attacked, rebelled against, or been bumped off by your family. So I think he knows his grandfather. He follows in a fairly new dynasty, a kind of Arabist group of military people, and he has 100 children.
Wow. Okay, so you save that.
We'll save that till his later reign. But as a boy, he must know he's destined for greatness. Right. That's not simply a back projection from when he becomes king, as some other pharaohs imagine, as if they'd been selected from the egg. They conquered in the egg. That is something that's said of other kings. Ramesses II as a prince really does seem to be groomed for greatness. And when he gets the chance, when his father eventually dies, he really goes for it on quite a scale.
This is a man who's royalty throughout his life. He's not the man who wins a coup or anything like that.
No, exactly. Yes, exactly. So he's, to himself, he's blue-blooded, but the family is fairly new. They're fairly new kids on the block, given the previous dynasty. The 18th dynasty is a long stretch of very interesting characters.
Well, the 18th dynasty, that is where we need to begin. So we're going back more than a century before Ramesses' reign. And the 18th dynasty, it is full of these incredible larger-than-life figures, isn't it? Tutankhamun, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, Akhenaten. I mean, paint us a picture of the 18th dynasty, quick.
Oh, well, that's very difficult. Okay, so you get some heavy hitters early on. So you have essentially the War of Liberation against the Hyksos, these northerners who have ruled Egypt and who need to be expelled. And that really heralds the beginning of the 18th dynasty, about 1500 and something BCE. And that's Ahmose. Ahmose, we're now calling him the second. He used to be called Ahmose the first.
Okay.
But because we've discovered an earlier Ahmose, we're calling him Ahmose the second. Then he initiates a line of not necessarily blood relations, because we get Amenhotep the first, who's a son of Ahmose, but then we get Thutmose the first. So he's a real warrior king, and he not only repels foreign invasions, he doesn't just expel people like Ahmose the first, but he actively seeks to expand that field of influence, that sphere of influence of Egypt. And I think it's that sets the precedent for Ramesses to look back on.
The whole dynasty, it's a time of kind of wealthy art and architecture, amazing structures like the obelisks, warrior kings, but also powerful queens as well, like Hatshepsut. So as you mentioned right at the start, this actually feels like the real zenith of ancient Egypt rather than the 19th dynasty that follows.
Yeah, I think that's fair. In kind of rough terms, if we're thinking about success as artistic quality, and that's very subjective, of course, criterion, and how much actual gold there is in the treasury. So Thutmose the third is an important character. He's sometimes called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. Expansionist. He is working in concert with his aunt, his stepmother, Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh, who rules for 20 odd years. By his side, much is made of the potential rivalry, the kind of the cookie cutter impression of the wicked stepmother. Forget it. The relationship is much more complicated than that. But setting the precedent for Ramesses II, Thutmose III leaves things in pretty good condition. His son Amenhotep II, pretty good. By the reign of Amenhotep III, you do get the impression that he's just sat down, just enjoying being luxurious because his forefathers have done it for him. He is not really going out doing battle. And then maybe the decadence sets in. And so his son is Amenhotep IV, better known as Akhenaten. And he is an unapologetic weirdo for an ancient Egyptian king. He kind of rips up the rule book to an extent. And then much is made, although I'm not sure how plausible I find this, much is made of the fact that we have an archive from the reign of Akhenaten and the end of the reign of Amenhotep III that talks about foreign diplomatic exchange. So you have a sense of, again, we're using modern terms which I probably don't apply, a foreign office which basically has cuneiform, the so-called Amarna letters that talk about, please my brother, because they're all calling the kings of the
this brotherhood of kings, isn't it, in that Bronze Age?
Of the Levant,
yes,
of the Bronze Age, that part of the world. They are asking, for the Egyptian king to send gold because gold is as plentiful as sand. Send me a real gold statue, a solid gold statue, not just a plated gold statue. Send me chariots, send me all the nice stuff. But there is a sense in which, and it may be typical, we don't have the other side of the dialogue, but there is a sense that the Egyptian king Akhenaten is maybe not doing as much as he could to maintain Egyptian imperial possessions. And that is important because there does seem to be a lull in Egyptian foreign influence in the Levant. And it is that, ultimately, that the dynasty of Ramesses II seeks to re-establish.
Exactly. So this almost steady decline of the 18th dynasty following Thutmose III, isn't it, that we're going to explore. And you mentioned source material there, like you had those letters in cuneiform. I mean, do we have quite a rich array of source material for learning about the 18th dynasty and the latter half of the 18th dynasty as we get to the rise ultimately of the House of Ramesses?
Well, we're so dependent on official proclamations, which are given a flavour, shall we say, if we're being positivist, that give some kind of flavour, but they don't recount the detail in anything like the way a historian would want today. But you're right that those cuneiform tablets, the Amarna letters, offer a really fascinating insight because these are one-on-one discussions. This is the Queen of Egypt rights, or the king of Egypt rights to their opposite number. So you get a sense of the geopolitics of the time, but it's shrouded in decorum,
Right.
what is appropriate to say in certain contexts, and we only really have one side of the discussion.
So if we have, let's say, Egypt at its height under Thutmose III, ruling an empire at that time, I mean, how big an empire should we be thinking of? And I want to ask that question first of all, because if we then fast forward to, let's say, the reign of Akhenaten, so we can get a real sense of how that empire is already transforming by that pharaoh by the time of Akhenaten and Amenhotep IV.
Yeah. So it purely in terms of geographical extent, and again, I emphasize,
Yes.
I wouldn't think of it as an empire like the Roman Empire or the British Empire, but it's an area of influence. Egypt itself, it should always be stressed, is the perfect country. So Egypt, bordered naturally by the Mediterranean, by the deserts, by the cataracts to the south at Aswan, is ideal. Egypt doesn't need to expand. It's already perfect, set by the gods. But to the north, in the reign of Thutmose III, there's areas of influence up to the Euphrates. Wow. So it's a big stretch of up into what is now modern Syria and Iraq, to the south, deep into what is now Sudan. To the west, of course, there's Libya, and we'll come back to Libya because Ramesses really makes a point of that as well. And so these are the kind of the natural extents of ancient Egyptian exploitation. So they want stuff. They're not interested really in everyone believing in the Egyptian way of life. Yes, there are elite key people that pay homage to the king and send tribute, but they want stuff. They want materials. They want gold. They want access to metals, to exotic products, to people. There's exploitation of people, of course. There are enslaved people in all of this, but maybe not quite of the character that maybe we've been led to think in scriptural sources.
And so that's it at its height. I mean, so how does it decline by the time we get to Akhenaten? A few decades, is it quite a few decades later, isn't it?
Yeah, so if we think, Thutmose is in the 1400s, Akhenaten is the mid-1300s.
Right, okay.
So 60, 70, 80 years later. There's a lot of ping-ponging goes on between... So if you're a kind of small state in the south of modern Syria, say, and you've got the Egyptians who claim, control or some kind of nominal control of your land and want you to send tribute, that's fine if they come and they have a military sortie and they beat you up. But then when the Egyptians withdraw back to their capital at Memphis, this will be important later, then they're quite far away from the south of Syria.
And Memphis is almost the northern capital as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the apex of the delta, where the delta meets the valley in Egypt. But then if you've got the Hittites, who are the north of Syria, you've got peoples to what is now modern Turkey. You've got the Assyrians, more towards the west. When they come and threaten you, you'll immediately change loyalty to the person, the big bad wolf that's closer to you. So the Egyptians always had a problem about exerting influence from so far away, and maybe that led to a shift in the notional capital, which was affected by the 19th dynasty.
So that's interesting. So do you therefore see as those decades go on in the 18th dynasty, do you see those new powers like the Hittites, like the Assyrians becoming more prominent, and Egypt, in contrast, these rulers become a bit more obsessed with their luxuries, this idea of decadence and so on. And so Egyptian power on the Bronze Age world stage does diminish, and the other powers like the Hittites does grow at that time.
Yes, there's definitely a sense of the expansion and the kind of awakening of other powers. But you're right to say that by the reign of Amenhotep III, so again, 1300s, there is this sense of the international court. So yeah, internationalism, it's a sign of kind of cosmopolitan life at court for the wealthy. But while people are enjoying, the latest imported pottery and very fine designs in jewelry, other military things might be slipping, and that is in proportion to the ambition of other powers.
Okay, so what follows Akhenaten? It doesn't end well for Akhenaten, does it?
Yeah, you could say that, I suppose. We don't know what exactly happens. Akhenaten's very experimental. The experiment backfires, and they have to undo all the revolutionary.
Well, sorry, very briefly, this experimental stuff. I know this is another episode in its own right, isn't it?
Right. So Akhenaten decides there are no gods but the sun god, a special form of the sun god, and he is the unique interlocutor with the sun god, the Aten. So that's why he changes his name from Amenhotep, the god Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. And then for, 15, 16, 17 years, he and his immediate successors, to a degree we're not quite sure of, espouse the worship of the Aten, and they close all the other temples. So quite apart from it just being a religious revolution, it is an economic challenge, because imagine you're the high priest of the god Amun, and the king says, nope, we're closing the temple of Karnak. Okay, then.
This is almost a bit of economic self-destruction at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, people have compared it to Henry VIII and monasteries and, trying to wrest power from these religious institutions into the hands of the king, which I think there's a good argument that that's what Akhenaten's trying to do. But it creates all kinds of issues. Anyway, Akhenaten says he himself is going to a new virgin site, his capital city, what we call Amarna now, the city of Akhet.
Hence the Amarna letters that you mentioned.
Exactly. So this is the source of the so-called diplomatic correspondence in the Foreign Office. But so that settlement in Middle Egypt is the home of the king. It's where the king and the elite are going to be buried, and you get the sense that Akhenaten's really kind of sequestered himself away at Amarna and is ignoring other things where traditionally the king in ancient Egypt moved around. It was a peripatetic court, as in other traditions. The king moves around to keep an eye on people, to make sure that they're loyal. Who knows what else is happening in Egypt at this time, but the court is focused in Middle Egypt. So you could see that the letters are arriving saying to Akhenaten, we could do with your help if you want to maintain your presence in this part of the Levant, then please send help. And he doesn't seem to send help.
He doesn't. So alarm bells are ringing. Feels a bit of a tumultuous time inside Egypt and beyond for Egyptian influence. So what follows him? I mean, how do we get to these last big figures in the 18th dynasty? And I guess this gradual decline that follows.
Well, the biggest name in terms of, historical cachet is, of course, Tutankhamun.
Tutankhamun, okay.
So Tutankhamun, by most accounts, is the son of Akhenaten, right? And he comes to the throne, we can be as sure as we can be sure, at 9 or 10 years old.
Oh dear, wow.
He's a little boy, and he is being controlled by kind of revisionist politicians, for want of a better term, who want to backtrack on the revolution. And so all of this is put in the words of the boy king. I have restored the temples. And where the gods, abandoned and ignored Egypt, I have propitiated them and put things back to how they were. Of course, a 10-year-old boy is not getting in a chariot, really. Maybe towards the end of his life, in his later teenage years, there is evidence that Tutankhamun does engage in some kind of military activity. But there must be powers, and we know there are powers, military powers, that are not blood relations of the royal family, who are thinking, right, we need to get some action going here to reclaim, or at least to maintain, some of these, again, areas of influence. I don't think it's trying to defend the empire, because I think the empire, such as it was, had already frayed. It is about trying to push those trade alliances, areas of influence.
So like military advisors at court kind of thing, or actual active commanders in the field?
Active commanders in the field. And so those people who usually would be kind of subordinate advisors to the king really rise in prominence. Right. So Tutankhamun dies however he dies, believe what you want, chariot accident, malaria, killed by a hippo, whatever. We'll never know. But then he's succeeded by this kind of shadowy elder figure, the god's father, who rules for a couple of years.
It's AY, isn't it? That's how his name is
yes,
spelled, right?
AY or AYE. He is very odd. And then he eventually is succeeded by an out-and-out military man. And this is your man Horemheb.
Now, this is a very interesting figure. So what do we know about Horemheb?
So Horemheb comes from non-royal backgrounds as far as we can tell. He must, of course, be a mover and a shaker. He's in the royal courts. But he clearly, we know from the extensive preserved evidence of his tomb at Saqqara, where he built a really impressive tomb chapel to celebrate his eternal cult. He was then in charge of the military. So he says he's the chief of the soldiers, the fighting men. He's also in charge of building works. And I think this is important to understand Horemheb. He is not just a military man, he's in charge of the recruits. And the recruits are guys who can equally be sent on a campaign to beat people up, as they can be sent to a quarry, as they can be sent to a mine. So you're in charge not just of, military personnel, but you're in charge of people. And so he's unusual. Horemheb is unusual because we've got statues of him where he's very proudly writing things down as a scribe. So don't think of him as a kind of meathead guy who's just a bit of a brute. I think he's intelligent. He's clearly someone who understands the workings of the state and who is proud of his ability as an administrator. So he really is an all-rounder. And so when the throne eventually passes to him, he's in charge for almost a couple of decades. He has a long reign. So he's again holding the reins of power. And he is the one who really goes back and tries to scrub out evidence of Akhenaten, or begins that process.
And he is a military usurper. So the fact that then he has a success. Oh, you took a big breath there.
Yeah. I mean that it sounds dramatic, but I don't think you're far from the truth. And so he instigates what is essentially a military coup.
Yes. That's what I'm thinking. And the state of the army at that time, because I can imagine almost Horemheb, if he's staged this coup, then he needs substantial support amongst the army itself. Do we know much about what the army looked like at this time? Is it split around the place? Is it professional? What should we be imagining?
So compared to earlier periods, say the Middle Kingdom, a few hundred years before, when we know there are military raids going on down into Nubia, up into the Levant, it seems that to raise an army, you basically go around and say, come on, chaps, who wants to fight? Whereas by the end of the 18th dynasty, there's a professionalization. So you will say, I'm a charioteer. My father was a charioteer. So there must be, I hesitate to say a military class, but there are a group of people whose ancestors have fought and done some pretty impressive things, possibly in the 18th dynasty. So yes, I think there is a professionalization, and maybe these people have been, in the reign of Akhenaten, possibly sitting around with nothing to do. And you could imagine someone like Horemheb organizing these people. And
that charismatic figurehead, right?
And in Horemheb's first, because he has two tombs, because he becomes a pharaoh and therefore takes a tomb in the Valley of the Kings down at Thebes. But in his first tomb, he's shown, engaged in things to do with military activity under Tutankhamun. So we should understand it that Tutankhamun is the notional patron. He's sending off the troops into battle, but it's Horemheb who's actually doing it and commanding them.
He's the one who probably has the respect more of the actual soldiers on the ground. And soldiers-wise, should we be thinking the chariots for the elites and then everyday Egyptian soldiers, archers or infantry with not too much equipment?
Yeah, so remember, we're still in the Bronze Age. You're fighting with bronze metal weapons. This is not the Iron Age yet in Egypt. You are going into battle, as a foot soldier with a shield, which is pretty important, a dagger or a sword, and an axe.
Oh, an axe.
So you're going to axe someone. But you should also, I guess, remember that the chariot is still a fairly modern invention. It's a couple of 100 years old. And I think we think of ancient Egypt as always having used chariots, but they've come into Egypt from the north, maybe brought with the Hyksos and these wars of liberation. And those are only, a couple of 100 years before. So Horemheb has the connections, the elite military connections with other generals. That's important. And then, as you say, he probably has the loyalty of the foot soldiers, the infantry.
It's so interesting with Horemheb because so often in ancient history, you might see, a dynasty, a royal figure be toppled by a military figure. But then so often, right after that, either that military figure proves incapable of being an administrator and ruling, or you see it just break out into other generals think, actually, I don't respect you as my leader anymore. I'm going to try and seize power myself. So you see a breakdown into civil war, the fracturing of kingdoms and so on.
Sure.
So does that make Horemheb's achievement even greater? The fact that he does reign for a long time and does prove to be quite an effective ruler.
Based on the evidence, this caveat.
Yes, that's a good point.
Based on the evidence that we have, of course, the ruler is honor bound to describe themselves as the best and God-given and doing everything very effectively. They're not recording negative things, but still you do get the sense that Horemheb is an effective ruler. The one thing that he lacks is an heir, a male heir.
Right.
And this is, again, some responsible thinking for any ruler. If you don't have an heir, you don't have a spare, you don't have a male descendant, blood descendant, you have to make plans to make it absolutely clear who is going to be the next king, because you could drop dead at any moment.
Is adoption a thing at the time?
Yes. Okay. Adoption is a social practice in Egypt. It's an important social practice. So at that level, I mean, it's relatively unusual that kings who have many wives don't somehow manage to produce a male heir. But Horemheb, for whatever reason, doesn't have surviving sons. So he adopts, for want of a better term, this chap, Ramesses, who is the vizier, the chati, the kind of chief minister, but also has a military background. And he is we know a bit about him, his background, his father, Seti, based in the eastern Nile Delta, so the family hometown is known about. And so he has the great advantage of having a living son and probably a living grandson. So there is a line ready. So maybe these guys are just mates, they're just friends from the battlefield, but maybe there are other strategic, social, political reasons.
So we can presume that, Horemheb choosing his heir, and Ramesses, probably was a loyal subordinate in the close circle, but also, aside from that loyalty, someone who had that family line.
Sure.
We don't know if he had any connection to the royal family of old at all, do we?
You could expect that if you didn't have a connection, you'd want there to be a connection by marrying a random princess of royal blood. That was quite effective. And it tended to be the blue-blooded women who really made the king, who really confirmed the legitimacy of the line.
So is Ramesses, can I clue in the name, is he the beginning of this new dynasty, of the 19th dynasty?
Yes, okay. And what Egyptologists call the Ramesside age, because he is, as king, when he becomes king, for a short time, for a couple of years, he takes the name Ramesses and he becomes Ramesses I.
He's Ramesses I, because we always hear about Ramesses II, don't we? But we don't hear about Ramesses I. And do we know much about his reign? It's short-lived, as you say, but do we know much?
It's short-lived. He has ambition. He starts a very nice tomb in the Valley of the Kings, which has to literally be cut short because he only lives a couple of years. But something about Ramesses I. So we are using these names, which are the people in question's birth names. So the parents of Ramesses I call him Ramesses, which means literally he of the sun god.
Wow. Okay.
But his name as king, he takes on a series of names, but the names the ancient Egyptians would have known these people by is the throne name, the prenomen, as opposed to the nomen. The nomen is your birth name, what your family might call you. But the throne name for Ramesses is telling. So he's called Men Pechti Re. So that means literally the strength of the sun god is established, or establishing the strength of the sun god. So Pechti means strength. And we know that the first king of the 18th dynasty, Ahmose II, who's this military guy, he is called Neb Pechti Re. So there's this reference to strength. And we know also that the family are from this part of the eastern delta in the north of Egypt, where the god Seth is the local patron.
Now, who's the god Seth?
Now, Seth, we've encountered him before, you and I.
Yeah.
But Seth is kind of the yin to the yang of Horus. So he's often described in very negative terms because he's a god of storms, and he tries to do nasty things to his nephew, but he's also great of strength. The god Seth is emblematic of this kind of brute, uncontrolled, voracious strength on the battlefield. So the fact that Ramesses I takes that name, I think, is politically and religiously, the two are interconnected, significant.
And so his family originates from the north of Egypt.
Yes.
But when he becomes pharaoh, at that time, does he have to relocate himself further south? Because you mentioned the Valley of the Kings earlier.
Yes.
Although Horemheb is buried much further north at Saqqara, but is it at that time that Luxor and ancient Thebes is the main centre of Egypt?
Yes, though I should say Horemheb's tomb is abandoned in the north because he's not really buried there, because he's a king. He has artisans go and add a snake to his brow on almost all the depictions of him in his tomb at Saqqara in the north, because he's become a king.
Right.
But a king in the new kingdom of Egypt at that time cannot be buried in a mere Saqqara tomb. He's got to be buried in the royal cemetery.
Right.
At the Valley of the Kings.
So there's a tomb of Horemheb at the Valley of the Kings?
At the Valley of the Kings.
Ah, okay.
So Ramesses I, and this is an interesting question, unlike Akhenaten, doesn't just stay in one place at one time and stick there. He moves around. I think he starts back, he continues this tradition of the peripatetic court, but there is definitely a favouring of the north.
Oh, okay.
And it may be that Ramesses I gives his name to an incredible new settlement developed by his son, Seti I, and his grandson, Ramesses II, and that is called Per-Ramses, or Per-Ramses, which in ancient Egyptian means House of Ramesses.
So this is why I wanted to talk about Ramesses I for quite a bit, because he lasts not very long at all, and yet from the surviving evidence of, first his son and then Ramesses the Great, you can actually see perhaps a few of the projects that he had in mind that he didn't get to live long enough to see through.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about it, Tristan, because I think, he gives his name to 11 kings. This whole period, as I said, is called the Ramesside period, and the first Ramesses I, must have ambition because he's chosen by Horemheb. He must be quite a dynamic guy, and he must pass on, at least to his son, if not to his grandson, spoken instructions for what he wants to achieve.
So Ramesses the Great, his grandson, is alive at the time.
He must
that
be.
Ramesses I is ruling for that period.
I think he must be.
Right.
So I think whether Ramesses II, the young prince, is already anointed as the chosen successor. I mean, even the concept of the crown prince that you get in modern European monarchies, I don't think that quite applies. You don't have to be, it is notionally the eldest son, but there is internal competition. And I think it is up to the reigning monarch, the king, to say, okay, you're better than him.
Right.
And so there's the heir apparent, may not necessarily be the eldest boy, but I'm as sure as I can be, given the reign length of Seti I, that the baby young boy Ramesses II is known to his grandfather.
Interesting. Well, then let's talk about Seti I. So what do we know about his reign following the death of Ramesses I?
He gets to it pretty quickly, and by most Egyptologists' estimation, Seti I really is a pretty self-conscious and effective patron of the arts. he takes this very interesting name, which is a throwback itself to earlier kings, Wechemesut, which means literally repeater of births. So literally in ancient Egyptian, it means Renaissance. He wants to undo a lot of the Amarna interlude. We know that. He goes around restoring images of Amun, adding his own name where the name wasn't there previously. And in that, he inspires his son deeply. I think there's a deep psychological thing about this. Still remember, New Kids on the Block, Arabist, Dynasty, they want to make absolutely sure that their claim is solid and will last. And they do that by restoring the works of their ancestors and shouting about how much they've restored the works of their ancestors. And so Seti I commissions this incredible temple, which still is one of my favourite sites in Egypt, at Abydos, the site in the south of Egypt, a bit north of Thebes. That's the sacred site of the ancient god Osiris. So you very easily, by building a temple there, connect yourself to this very long-standing cult of the god of rebirth. And in that temple, beautifully decorated temple, there is a very significant corridor, very significant for historical reasons, because following on a tradition, which itself is quite old, of celebrating previous kings, there is a scene of Seti I and his young son Ramesses reading out, declaiming, announcing, ritualizing the names of all their predecessors. And this hall of ancestors is significantly located between the abattoir and the temple offering rooms. So all the offerings of, the beef have to go in front of the corridor. So you are feeding the souls of everyone named on the wall as you pass. So it's this metaphysical sense of not just celebrating, look at all these great kings who've come before, but ensuring that their souls quite literally are sustained with offerings by locating the offering list in this particular place. It also anchors Ramesses II in as prince.
Crown prince this time, we think, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really as the heir apparent. Yeah. And there must be, what's not uncommon in ancient Egypt, a co-regency. So there is not just a crown prince, there is a nominated successor who kind of shares the throne. Maybe, Seti I saw or foresaw that he wasn't going to live a very long life. He can only be 40-ish when he dies. And then Ramesses II must come to the throne pretty young. 20 maybe.
I mean, it feels like Seti, his reign, it's a decade or so, isn't it? Or
yeah, a bit more than a decade.
But yes, because Ramesses I has died so quickly, he is focused in kind of consolidating the new dynasty, legitimizing its position with those kind of images, those dedications to temples and ancestors. But also, I guess, military activity too. That's another important thing he has to do. Yes,
absolutely. You're right. We know this on the north wall of the outside of the main temple of Amun at Karnak.
Yes.
You've been there. You've stood in front.
It's stunning. I mean,
my gosh. And often it's missed by tourists. They're impressed by the hypostyle hall and what's going on inside. But if you step outside, you see an absolutely incredible depiction of military engagements where, Seti I is leading his troops into battle along the ways of Horus. So this is up northeast into the Levant. And so there's a lot of trying to control these ping pong states to try and get them back under Egyptian control. And where in some cases, especially when it comes to the Hittites, you get the impression that Seti I will let he picks his battles quite literally, and he lets some sleeping dogs lie, where maybe Prince Ramesses, who may actually be involved, he may be as a teenager, physically be involved on campaign. You get the sense maybe Seti I stops short where Ramesses II wants to continue and push further when eventually he becomes king.
It's like Philip II of Macedon and Alexander the Great. It's the dad that lays the foundations for the son to follow in the footsteps. Interesting.
Good analogy, yeah.
But no, I just want to focus a bit more on that north wall of the hypostyle hall at Karnak, because you look at it, and one of my favourite pictures, parts of it, is you see a river full of crocodiles.
Yes, yeah, you're snapping at the poor unfortunates who've gone into the river.
This idea that the Egyptians have to cross this river, I think it's like the Sinai Peninsula, that area they think it is, or around there, or a bit further, to get into Syria where they're campaigning. And then I think you see another depiction of Kadesh, of all places, in Seti's reign. And he's besieging Kadesh at that time. It's Seti, not Ramesses.
Indeed. So people hear Battle of Kadesh, and if they know anything about ancient warfare, they think of Ramesses II. But the grudge with Kadesh definitely dates back to the reign of Seti the first. So Kadesh is in what is now modern Syria. So it's far from Egypt. It takes several weeks to go there by foot with a big army. But that's what Seti does. He goes, he campaigns there. And this is partly a hangover of the Amarna period, that those depictions are so detailed. That is an Amarna thing. You would never see that level of detail in the reign of Thutmose III. And maybe there's something to be proven. Maybe it's Seti I really trying to make the point that there must be something like a kind of court war correspondent or war artist, because the detail is very specific. And most ancient Egyptian scenes do not reflect history as it happened and don't reflect the world as it actually is. But yeah, there are details that bring about this world in which foreigners, anyone who's unfortunate enough to be non-Egyptian, is in disarray, and the Egyptians are successful on campaign. So the local detail, the scenes of a siege, fortifications, canals, rivers, siege warfare, that does seem to ring true.
With Seti's reign, although he doesn't last very long, actually one other thing, we mentioned Karnak there and the hypostyle hall, which we normally associate with Ramesses II. Constructed beginning under Seti, or maybe even older than that, do we think?
I think it maybe was conceptualized all the way back under Amenhotep III, and Seti I does the bulk of the work.
Okay.
So I think it's really realized by Seti I, and he begins to decorate it, and by the time he dies, it's half finished.
Right.
And so Ramesses II completes it. But it is an absolutely astounding piece of architecture, world architecture, absolutely breathtaking.
And his tomb as well in the Valley of the Kings, it's one of the most pristine, remarkable tombs.
Jewel-like. And it's funny because Ramesses II's is in real terms bigger, but is much, much less well preserved.
Interesting. Well, that's Seti's reign. I mean, how successful would you argue that Seti is? Because normally it is the case that the predecessor really sets the scene for the greatness of the person that follows in several cases, once again, Philip and Alexander. How successful do you think Seti is in the context of consolidating control and getting the 19th dynasty really on track?
Oh, I think he's pretty successful. I think he as you said, sets the train in motion for what he hopes is going to be a long-lived dynasty, as we'll discuss maybe in the next episode. The fact that his son is so long-lived may actually compromise Seti's plans. But as a military man, clearly, I guess Seti I would have remembered a time when he was not meant to be the king. He was a military general. He was the son of a military general. He was someone important, but he had to prove himself amongst his colleagues. His peers, exactly. So he has the kind of kingship thrust upon him, you could say. So he has that genuine ingenuity where in his conscious life, Ramesses II was always a prince. So you always have that kind of the silver spoon in his mouth. So maybe his ambition is slightly different from his father's. But his father, especially in terms of architectural and artistic work, as you mentioned, the tomb in the Valley of the Kings, work at Karnak, other sites as well, but the temple of Seti I at Abydos. These are just beautiful things. And I think he does instigate this co-regency that sets the scene for Ramesses II. And when eventually Ramesses II takes the throne, he says at that Abydos temple, I arrived here and found it unfinished, and I finished it in honor of his father. So he doesn't change the names. Well, he does around the edges perhaps. He completes it in his own name, which is completely okay by ancient Egyptian standards. It's not that the son is trying to elbow the father out of the way. He's simply complimenting his father because kingship is timeless, and none of those images of the kings look like the real people on the walls. So you can simply continue the imagery. It's not a conflict in the way we might think.
And so we get to the reign of Ramesses II. We'll cover only the first few years as we wrap up this episode. But firstly, is there any challenger to Ramesses II's succession? If Seti's made it quite clear in his wall paintings and the reliefs that he seems to be the clear heir apparent, do we know much about the succession and whether there was any difficulty around it?
Well, there's an interesting set of evidence at Karnak where there's a chap called Mehu or Mehi, who is shown in a very prominent position in these battle reliefs. So you get the sense that this guy is the right-hand man. And in some of those reliefs, his image is changed to being Prince Ramesses. Now, I wouldn't make too much of this. I think that's just what's appropriate to Ramesses II. I don't think this represents another rival claimant to the throne. It may just be when the reliefs were executed, it was fitting at the time. And then as time progressed, Ramesses II really wanted to claim part of that legacy. But no, the succession seems fairly clear. As I said, there is a co-regency, and for example, that scene in the Hall of Ancestors at Abydos, you can see that is a product of the work of Seti I, when Seti I is still alive. So it seems that Ramesses II is the anointed heir and is accepted as such. And
how does he initially reign? What do we know about those earliest years of Ramesses II as pharaoh?
You get the impression, well, he has to finish off some of his dad's building stuff, but you do get that sense that he's itching to get in a chariot and go and beat up some foreigners. So, as I say, it's probably likely that he had some experience in the entourage, at least, of his father. Whether he's actively out on the front lines is another question. That doesn't seem to happen later in Ramesses II's own reign. But he goes, year 4, year 5, so early in the reign of Ramesses II's long time in the throne, he goes out to Kadesh again. And he wants to confirm the status of these vassal states. So these are kind of client kingdoms. Again, I resist this term empire. It's not like they're trying to turn them Egyptian. It's trying to get their loyalty, their fealty, their
almost buffer states as well, I guess. Buffers, vassals.
Against a more problematic enemy, which in the early part of the reign of Ramesses II, that's the Hittites.
It's the Hittites.
Okay. That's like the north of Syria, even into modern Turkey is the seat of the Hittite Empire.
So he feels he has unfinished beef with Kadesh after his dad. So he goes up to Syria, and is this when we get the famous Battle of Kadesh?
Yes, and it's famous because he tells us so many times he's done it. It's recorded in several temples, his Mansion of Millions of Years, which we'll talk about separately, Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel. He's talking about this a lot. And so, the engagement is fascinating because we know a lot from recorded speeches. So you get this sense not just of the action as it plays out, but of the psychology of the king. Because there are, we can tell something about the organization of the military. So you have the infantry, you have the chariots divided up into divisions, and the divisions are named after gods. I don't know how common that is in the ancient world.
I can't think of any other examples that come to mind straight away. I'm sure someone will have a comment there and saying that there might be one. But no, When you think of divisions of armies, you do think of Kadesh and this description that you have, right?
Yeah, so they're named after the major gods of Egypt: Amun, Ptah, Seth, and the sun god Re. And so in the account, it's very unusual. The Kadesh account is unusual because it's unusually reflective because it allows that mistakes are made by the Egyptians. So it talks about, these informants are captured, and these non-Egyptian informants, and they say, the Hittite ruler is 120.
He's far away.
He's really far
forward.
away,
Okay.
leagues off. And so the Egyptians are okay with that. And so they kind of become a little complacent, maybe, when they're marching to make camp near Kadesh. Then they get hold of better intelligence, which says that the Hittites are much closer. And the Hittites, surprise, surprise, attack the Egyptians when they're unprepared. And so there's this extraordinary episode in which the attack comes, and it's really, the king is said to be alone. He finds himself alone. And so the drama is, and of course you can see how Ramesses spins this, basically, the greatness of the king comes at the expense of the soldiers, who are usually said to be pretty good and pretty effective. No, they're deserters or they're disorganized, and so Ramesses personally has to fight off the Hittites, pursues them into the river, and so manages to win a kind of stalemate. So it's less bad than it could have been. I mean, imagine the king could have been captured or killed, or much worse could have happened. The Egyptians suffer, it is acknowledged, some heavy losses, but they are able to maintain this status quo. So it's a draw, basically. Yeah. The Battle of Kadesh in the Hittite eyes is a success for them, but in the Egyptian eyes, it's a success for the Egyptians. And Ramesses, at least early on, spins this as better to kind of keep it as it is, and then later we'll go back and regroup, and in a couple of years
He snatches a draw from the jaws of defeat.
Yes.
And you do get a sense then, don't you, putting aside all the Ramesses' own spin on it that he does later, this sense of this young, rash, kid, like new
young
pharaoh, young man, I know, who wants to kind of follow in his dad's footsteps, but doesn't have the military intuition there, maybe, that he's lured into a bad position, bad intelligence, then gets the better intelligence later. And he's outwitted by this other king, by this Hittite ruler and his chariots and the like, isn't it? Yeah,
it's for the first time you see an Egyptian king and his opposite number, essentially the enemy, on a kind of even footing. So it almost emphasizes the scale of the challenge, and so the relative success of the draw, I guess. The Hittites, in terms of numbers, are a big force. So to have got that stalemate is a win for Ramesses.
So how significant do you think is the result at Kadesh for Ramesses if you look at what he does afterwards? If you take the actual military effect of it out of the picture, the fact that it is a draw, but is it ultimately a success for Ramesses because of what he then later does with that?
Yes, because I think he can come back to Egypt. Remember, there are no, it's obvious to say, but it sounds a bit trivial, there are no smartphones, there are no photographs. The king has come back, and maybe he's captured some booty from the battlefield, and he says, yeah, great success, guys. You will believe whatever the returning force says. You don't have the the fact checking. You don't have the counter narrative. So for Ramesses to come back after, God, it must be more than a year away. So the king has been away from Egypt, away from the capital, away from the palace for a long time. So for him to come back with some stuff and the story is a success enough.
And then he'll just paint those pictures of him on the walls of temples there, looking triumphant as a figure to try and reinforce that image of a successful returning king.
Absolutely. And I think also there is a sense of it being a stopgap, because you could imagine he is still young. It's only year 5, year 6. You could think, right, well, I'll go back and have another go in future, and then I'll recarve the wall, or I will achieve the success that I'm claiming on the wall as it stands.
So is it very much Kadesh and its result? This is only the beginning of Ramesses' story. This is only the beginning of his reign, and he's still got a lot to do, a lot to learn, and a lot to show off.
Yes, I think he does think of it as a lesson. I mean, if we could try and get into his head, but it's a start for 10. It's not the end of the story.
And we'll continue that in the next episode. Campbell, as always, such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Great, thanks.